Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this latest edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called One Taken, One Gathered, written by MyNameMeansBentNose. The peoples of the world had their own gods. Dwarves, owlkin, gnomes, humans, and others, all races, had their own pantheons. Above those gods existed the highmost. The gods are the very elements of the world, one for each of the elements, light and dark, fire and water, earth and wind, and a seventh for those people called unsown, who had it within them to become aspected to any of the six. Between the greater elemental gods and the lesser cultural gods existed a third set. These other gods, they had various titles. The All-Gods, the Cardinals, the Duels, each god unique to no people, claiming their right to aspects universal to all peoples. They represented the best and worst of all those things. Furastasia, of fury and justice. Amoebido, of lust and love. Superophance, of pride and arrogance. Lasus Factio, of sloth and satisfaction. Avaratius, of greed and charity. Amaravita, of envy and admiration. Gerdintia, of gluttony and prudence. Fancy names for fancy gods, but the common soul knew of them by the face they wore, such as Furistitia, being called rage, justice, hate, or passion, depending on what whim had taken it. Each incarnate is known by many names, with one exception. She possessed two names. A black-robed lady, known both by her appearance as the Masked and by her function, Death. It has long been known that children have a sensitivity beyond that of adults when faced with the strange. It is rare that an adult is able to maintain that sense of curiosity and wonder through their later years in the face of eking out a marginally comfortable existence. Pella didn't know her grandmother was such a person. Pella just knew that she loved the woman who never brushed off Pella's wild stories. That is why it went that way. When he walked past the window of the outermost house of the village, Pella found herself spooked. She might not have put it that way, but when she ducked out of a window, that was the thought that crossed the mind of Pella's grandmother. Elodie couldn't let go, of course. She mustered her strength. "Come here, child. Do you see something?" Little Pella turned her head, looking at her beloved grandmother with wide eyes, and patted across the floor. "No," Pella replied habitually. Elodie laughed weakly. "There is no one else here, my child." Mustering what strength she could, she lifted an arm slowly from the bed and rested it on Pella's head. The little 8-year-old reached up with two arms and held her grandmother's wrinkled hand as it slid to Pella's cheek. Pella rested a third on the hand closest to her that remained on the bed. Ellie continued to smile at the child that wasn't truly of her blood, but had been a better granddaughter than she'd hoped for. "I saw a human with a raven on its shoulder," Pella whispered, and a mask on its outer shoulder." "Oh," Ellie responded, letting the word draw out gently. "Did it scare you?" Pella paused for a long moment as she thought about it. Her grandmother never made fun of Pella's true feelings after all. Finally she answered, "No, but you look so sad." A hint of a smile played across Elodie's face. Pella's missed a subtle look of realization in Elodie's eyes. "You have nothing to worry about from him, little Pella." Ellie let her hand fall to the bed. "Now, close the windows and see to your parents." "Okay," Pella replied. She padded over to the window to close the shutters against the chill wind of the late season and headed to the door. "See you later, Grandma." Pella had run off before Elodie could form the words, but that didn't stop her from speaking them. "At least once more, I beg." The raven turned her head and called, a low sound drawn out for a moment. Corin turned his head to follow her line of sight. "Something to worry about, lady." The raven shook her head, followed a moment later by her shaking out her wings, giving no response to the question. Corin looked at the cluster of huts at the entrance of this little village. South Bend wasn't a big place by any stretch of the imagination, but a stopover between somewhere and absolutely nowhere. But then, he was just as likely to end up in either of those places. More than a few shutters closed at his passing. In some places, a tall, dark stranger might draw interested gazes, but with a raven on his shoulder and him all in black, far be it from any superstitious villagers to strike up a conversation with the man. The inn was up ahead, a small building for a small village. It looked to have a tavern on the front with a second story at the back for travelers and another building attached for the owners. The village was as busy as expected in midday. Children ran past him, laughing and waving sticks, backs laden with baskets full of forest bounty. The pinging of metal on metal rang out in the blacksmith here on his left. An elderly dwarven woman glanced sideways at him as she hung clothes out to dry on his right, the second set of arms shaking out a shirt. Most of the adults would be out seeing to crops. There was much to harvest after all. Corin arrived at the door with a glance upwards. A wind-bent tree with countless hanging branches decorated the sign hanging above the door. Just as he had been told by a passing stranger, he had been promised good food here. Corin looked forward to it. He pushed his way through the door, setting off a set of wood chimes and alerting the proprietor. "Oi!" a voice shouted out further in. "Come here a moment, sir. I'll be right there with you." A clatter of noise clearly told Corin the dishes were being cleaned. Corin walked in to look over the public room, a handful of tables surrounded by squat, sturdy chairs. Only one equally sturdy and squat, wrinkly old man sat within the room, the dwarf napping in his seat while nursing a drink. The walls were decorated with antlers and more than a couple crude wood carvings of animals or scenery, almost certainly made during a long winter days. The room was dim, lit only from the open windows adjacent to the entrance and sides of the room. Further in was a bar in front of an open door into what was certainly the kitchen. Corin shed his travel pack, letting it hit the empty floor next to the entrance with a heavy thump. Then walked to the bar to sit in the middle stool with a sigh. The tables he had walked past and the bar were smooth and clean, the only hint of mess being an empty plate in front of the napping old man. Well, a well-cared-for place that matched up well with Corin's other senses. Moments later, a squat old dwarf stepped out, a typical hill dwarf, an old man with proper head full of gnarled roots growing with the bright green leaves. He had stripped his root beard of leaves, however, a habit typical of dwarves who often cook. One set of thick hands perpetuated the eternal stereotype of barman everywhere of drying a cup he was holding onto with a cloth. His other set of arms he placed on the bar, his knuckles and wrist covering by patches of thick bark. "Well, I'm Nock, the owner of this wind-brent boilo. What can I do for you, human? Yeah, for a night, or maybe more." "Just one night," Corin replied with a friendly tone while laying a few coins on the bar. It was rare that he had a luxury to stay anywhere longer than that. "But I have heard good things on the road about your food. I don't suppose that you might have something on the go." I can do soup and bread for you this hour," Nock noted, picking up the coin and biting it before nodding. "For more, it's gonna have to be later in the day. And your companion?" Nock gestured to Corin's raven with a hand palm up, not a twitch of suspicion in his face. Somewhat rare for a dwarf. But then, Nock would see every traveler to visit this place, and not everyone feared what Corin was. "I understand. The lady and I can just share with," Corin replied. "I'm hoping for some good food, but I admit my stomach isn't feeling so choosy." "Ha ha ha!" Nock laughed. "Well, if you're staying the night, the stair leads up to the rooms with another stair to the back." Nock turned and walked back to the kitchen. "Well, get comfy and I'll get you a key and some soup." Corin settled in. "So, Nock," Corin yelled in a friendly tone to the dwarf as the gnarled old man left the site. "Anything interesting going on?" Nothing less was expected than the sharing of news. If he didn't ask Nock, the dwarf would ask him. They conversed until Nock returned with the promised items, and conversed afterwards as Corin ate. As Corin had hoped, the food was good. Halfway through the meal, a little dwarf girl with a wonderfully leafy braid of roots wound around her head ran in. She looked at Corin for a moment, with nervous eyes that flitted back and forth. He didn't miss where the eyes landed. "Ah, Bella," Nock called. "Come on, then. There's work for it to be done."
"Yes, Papa."
A few things went quite as ugly as the problem of inheritance. Grandmother Elodie had lived a very long life, but had only had the fortune to bear a single child. Unfortunately, that son of hers had failed to be anything other than a burden and a beast. While Elodie did her best to raise a good son, the early death of her husband had inflicted a great deal of damage on those plans, and her son had long been strange, with all the signs pointing to a dark future. The harassment and cruel pranks upon other children, the savaged and twisted bodies of dead animals. Arquette ran away from the little village, South Bend, determined to make something of himself in the capital. He had also stolen his father's sword and dagger, as well as a stash of coins on his way out. He returned decades later, destitute and damaged. The sullen, impatient, and cruel young man simply added bitter and old to the list of descriptors on his return. What Arquette found upon his return was an ailing mother who had declared her wealth to go to the innkeeper and his daughter. A mother who wouldn't even let him sleep in his old room. Conversations had been had over time. Nock and Elodie were more than willing to cede the house to Arquette, but Elodie would be handing many of her worldly goods over to Nock for the sake of Pele, and she would not tolerate Arquette in the house until she was no longer there. He would have to stay at the inn. Forget that Nock put Arquette up for no cost. Nothing less than everything that was his mother's would satisfy Arquette. Many were convinced that Arquette's anger and bitterness had driven Elodie to the brink of her end far faster than necessary. It was a difficult suggestion to deny. In truth, Elodie's love for little Pella soothed the old woman's soul. Elodie was simply at the end of the best life that she knew how to live. While Arquette was useless in many ways, he at least proven himself as a possible hunter. But possible was not the same as successful. And on this day he returned empty-handed. His temper had long simmered since the day of his return to the village and never settled. Long, Arquette had depended on drink to dampen his dark moods, and for the most part, it worked. But here, in South Bend, well, if he wanted to drink, he had to look at Nock. He had to look at Nock, and he had to look at little Pella as she scurried about delivering food and taking dishes from patrons. Such was his mood that he didn't even notice the human garbed in a black with a raven on his shoulder that evening. Such was his mood that when the tavern closed for the night and Nock's wife shooed everyone out, Arquette followed the innkeeper and his daughter to what was supposed to be his house, Arquette's hand on his pocket. Such was his mood that he never noticed the one who followed him. But then, there was something more involved in that case. Bella ran up first and put her hand on the door, but her papa's voice caused her to turn. "Well, what do you think you're doing tonight, then?" She turned around to see old Arquette at the short path to the house, standing on the first flagstone, his dull grey roots and leafless head shifting slightly as he looked past her papa and at her. "I think it is time that we do another chalk," Arquette replied, his voice low. Pella didn't like the look in his eyes, although his eyes were really anything but cold. "We already talked, and we ain't gone to an agreement you liked yet," Papa replied with annoyance as he turned. "If you're willing to give ground, we could keep going in circles." Papa stepped forward, putting himself between Pella and Arquette. Then another person arrived, the human her papa had been talking with a black coat, with a strange emotionless mask on one shoulder, with a raven with glittering eyes on his other. "Well," Arquette replied, walking up to Papa, "I think I have another point worth listening to." "And what's that?" Papa asked. Pella looked into the next yard. The neighbors were watching closely. Her papa and grandmama's son. She glanced further down the way and found more were watching, but no one was looking at the outsider. "Well, what I've been thinking," Arquette said, slowly drawing out his words as he slowly stepped forward. Pella looked at the dark man, then heard him speak as he looked to the raven. "This is the first. He unhooked the mask from his shoulder and held it over his face. She could see through the eye holes as he picked it up, but when he looked through it, she could see nothing. "Ah, so it's him. But does it have to be?" the raven called. Pella knew that they were talking. "No," Papa said harshly, his tone pulling Pella's stare away from the human. Her papa stepped up and bumped against Arket's chest, upper arms crossed, lower arms with hands and hips. "You've been thinking all kinds of things, sir, and they are all words dung. I ain't gonna consider talking with you, unless you say you're gonna give ground." Arket moved suddenly, yet the human was quicker. The mask fell from his face, and the raven flew as the human rushed in like a blur of shadow. Suddenly, he was grappling with Arket. Papa stumbled and fell to his butt, utterly surprised by the sudden scuffle. Now Pella was convinced no one had even noticed him. A human was no match in close quarters for a dwarf. That's how it should have been. But just as quick as it had started, it was over. It was a soft sound from Arket that ended the short fight. "Ah!" Such a simple sound. Corin stepped away. Arket's upper arms were held up and away. His lower arms clutched the dagger in his stomach. "What did you do, human?" Papa shouted suddenly. Pella ran up and grabbed her papa's closest hand.
I saved you,
she whispered with fright, shivering as she hid behind her father. Silence reigned as the dwarf named Nock finally looked at Arket. Arket stumbled back, then pulled the dagger from his gut, only for the blade to hit the stones with a clatter. Arket looked up at the human, then just as suddenly his gaze snapped to another and his face twisted into an expression of utter fear, and he squealed. He left the blade where it lay as he scrambled back to his feet, stomach leaking blood. There it lay as he turned and ran, gasping and frantic. There it lay as he escaped into the dark of night. The dagger glinted with red and with green. No one spoke, their words frozen in the night. Then everyone realized the human was no longer there. Arket was easy enough to track in his panic-fueled escape. When they finally found him, he lay dead and cold. Pella lay in Elodie's arms, crying softly. Ellie's labored breathing likely added to the child's distress. "It's okay. It's okay," Ellie said with care and love as she stroked the back of Pella's head, rustling the young leaves of Pella's braid. "It's okay. It's okay." A couple of hours had passed. Nock and his wife Ryan sat in the living room, having closed the door behind them so that Ellie could comfort the young Pella in peace. But Elodie had a touch of curiosity left in her, and she was afraid for the Pella, who would soon have even fewer to talk to. What did you see, little Pella?" Pella froze. Several moments passed, and then she lifted her head to look at Ellie with the tear-stained eyes. Ellie gathered her breath and spoke further. "They told me of the man, but what did you see? What did the rest not see?" Pella wiped her face with her sleeve, clearing away tears and a little snot. She closed her eyes, ordering her thoughts like her grandma had always taught her. Finally, she opened her eyes. Now clear with concentration and will, she spoke.
"The human, he followed Arket here, but no one saw him,"
Pella replied with confidence. She trusted what she saw, and she knew Grandmama would believe it. "He had a mask on his shoulder, and a mask no one else seemed to notice. He held it over his face, but when he put it on, I couldn't see his eyes." "Did the mask change?" Elodie asked.
Not yet,"
Pella replied. "Not yet?"
"At first, the mask was blank and had no expression."
Ellie nodded her understanding. It hadn't been time yet. Of course it wouldn't change.
"But then the human dropped it, and it vanished for a moment. And at the same time, the raven flew away. But then the raven came back, but it wasn't a raven no more."
"Ah, the raven was wearing the mask," Elodie guessed.
"Yes, but it turned into something. It turned into smoke. That smoke got bigger until it looked like a human to a woman. But her mask was very angry, wasn't it?"
Pella's voice was very faint at the end.
"Angry, yeah, and sad."
Elodie pulled Pella in for a reassuring hug. Even that was almost too much for her. She then turned and looked. Well then, what do you have to say for yourself?" she asked. "Was it a split?" "Yes, he replied. I was given the luxury of a choice tonight. Bella jerked away, turning in surprise to see the man sitting at Eddie's small desk. The chair looked too small under his tall frame. Again, the raven sat on his right shoulder, and the mask hung off his left. Ah, good for Nock. It would be a tragedy for him to go so soon, Elodie replied softly, but no split for me. No, he replied. I'm sorry. Sorry, Elodie said with a surprise, her voice rising slightly. Her laughter turned into hacking in her ill health. She took a moment to collect herself as Bella's head swiveled back and forth. Ah, forgive me, Eddie said softly. Of course. Grandmama, rest, child. I know I've scared you, but for him to visit me is an honor. May I know your name? The man looked out the window for a moment. There was a hint of light in the dark morning sky, his face flickering slightly with emotions as he gathered himself. Ah, to see his concern, Elodie wondered if he was new to the role. He turned back. I am Corin. He turned to look at his raven, while reaching across himself to pull the mask off his shoulder as he stood. And this is Lady Charisse. Bella watched nervously, naturally afraid of the woman and the angry mask. Corin held up the mask, passing it in front of the raven and Charisse, while stepping to his left. The raven disappeared in a cloud of smoke. That smoke billowed out and coalesced into a feminine figure robed in black. The mask shifted, not to rage as Bella expected, but to a soft grief and gentle love. Grandmama? Bella asked again, clearly afraid. At rest, my child, Eddie said, mustering the last of her strength for one last hug, pulling Bella to her chest. The masked lady has come for me, and your face is full of love. What? Bella cried after her adopted grandmother explained. No, be at rest, my beloved Bella. It is time that I go with love and grace. No! Bella cried weakly into Ellie's chest, hiding her face from the truth. Corin looked to his lady Charisse. She waited patiently. Bella cried in Elodie's arms, her shoulders shaking as she cried herself out, until finally she let go. Bella stood back, touching her grandmama's cheek one last time. Ellie wiped away the last of Bella's tears, or at least that's the last that she would see, then looked at Corin. Only human advocates of the vessel are given to making a choice. Uncooperative younglings, right to the end. Well, sometimes it is better that way, Corin replied, a little indignant. The lady leaned slightly, stretched out a hand, pale, cold flesh, and touched Ellie's cheek. The old woman sighed. Oh, so warm, and breathed her last. You won't stay? Nock asked quietly. It's been a difficult night, and you still got my gratitude. No, as I said, I was only here for a day. I really do have places to be. Very well then, safe travels, good man. Corin shifted the pack for comfort, and Lady Charisse squawked and fluttered her wings to balance. I appreciate it. It has been a pleasure. The human stepped out, not expecting to see Nock again, or at least for quite some time. He stepped out to the somber morning, many still in mourning for the loss of the cherished elder, a feeling he knew all too well. Quietly, respectfully, he walked back the way that he'd come, passing the houses and somber villages, passing a house now entirely empty of life and heading down a path. He had many days ahead of him. The forest was thick along the path, but there was nothing new to him. At the intersection that split off the path to the village of the South Bend, he found a small girl resting against a tree, her eyes red from crying, but silent for now. As soon as she saw him, Bella climbed to her feet and stared at him. He stood in front of her, standing at the path. He traded somber looks with a tiny girl standing within the shadow of a tree much taller than him. A slight wind rustled the leaves of the tree and the leaves on her head. Corin smiled, friendly but sad, and spoke. Do you know, little Bella, why ravens are the symbol of the vessel? No, Bella whispered softly, watching with sharp eyes. Many think that it is because they are scavengers that eat refuse and the fallen. Cherry squawked rudely at him and shook her tail. Corin smiled again and continued, but that's far from the whole truth. Pella didn't respond. The other reason is because ravens and their smaller cousins, the crows, they aren't just scavengers. These birds find the jewels, the shining treasure, and carry them off. Corin reached up, and his lady leaned into his neck scritch. Corin looked at his companion, his smile turning soft. Just as the vessel finds shining souls to deliver them safely to the next life.
My grandmama, she's happy now.
I don't know, but she lived as good a life as she could, Corin replied. And I think you were all the reward she ever hoped for. Pella had one last question. She screwed up her face and concentrated hard on her words to overcome her natural accent.
Why, Charisse?
Corin sighed. He reached up and cupped the raven's side, putting the black bird to his cheek. Because this is my beloved Lady Charisse, as a good woman as I've ever known. She's my love, a woman I was unable to give up, to my bitter end. The raven squawked in complaint, finally, and wiggled free to jump on his head. That's how we were chosen, really. The true disciples, the advocates of the masked. We are those who simply wouldn't accept, until a deal was struck.
Are all vessels ravens?
Well, no, but they are the most common.
Oh.
Pella didn't say anything more, but her shoulders drooped, and she leaned back against the tree. Corin looked at her for a moment, but with her curiosity satisfied, Pella had nothing more to say. Corin nodded, turned, and continued down the path. Pella may have been a young girl, but she wasn't ignorant of the stories. People passed on to the next life all the time, and all over the place. How could the Masked One be everywhere to collect those unfortunate souls? Well, the Masked One had help, advocates, and vessels, roaming the world to collect the newly departed. The masks they wore a symbol of their duty and of their god. To the living, the mask showed a blank white face, void of expression. To those on the cusp, the mask reflected the worth of the life coming to an end. Pella watched the human walk, death riding his shoulder. Watched until he was long out of sight. It would be a much longer time before she admitted that she had seen the vessel of the masked, the god of death. That she had seen the mask filled with wrath for a soul turned evil. That she had witnessed the mask of grace for a soul that was truly good. All brought into her life by a human with a smile that was a mask of its own. End of story. I would just quickly like to thank the T5 peeps. Dragon Soup, Cold War Boomerwaffen, Severin Cerberus, Red Panda 121, Leslie 517, Bushmaster 177, Caspar Arnholtz, Cam Maxwell, Sans the Skeleton, Light Jock, Dragzoon WRE, and Lord Azrakal. Thank you very much.